And I'm going to talk today about three reforms. Alan and Mark have really set this up great. I, I don't think we really need, in some respects, to look so much more at the shape of polarization. They've teed this up very well. So I'm going to look at three reforms, but I think some of these reforms and some of the patterns I'm going to show you will illuminate some of the patterns that especially Alan was discussing. So I think there's a bit of a dialogue here when we start moving to reforms. And I also suspect, though I haven't seen all the papers for the rest of the day, that I suspect that what I'll be covering here with reform will also tee up what we're going to talk about in later panels as well, where people start debating what can we do about this polarization. So I'm going to look at three. One is looking at primaries, and I'm going to be looking at closed, really I'm going to be looking at semi-closed primaries so for some reasons about party registration, which I'm going to come clear in just a minute, redistricting, and looking at small donors. And these are, all three of these are papers that I am currently writing, and some of them are under review, some of them are in other stages with various co-authors. So I will point out those co-authors along the way. So first is primary elections. This is with Matthew Thornburg. He's a recent PhD graduate from George Mason University. This is his dissertation. And he's been looking at party registration, how it anchors people's partisan identification, and how it also plays out in open versus closed versus semi-closed primaries. We're extending some of the work to open primaries as well. So here's the idea, because I know a lot of people have said, well, primaries don't matter. Well, we're looking at the end part of the whole process, and there's a lot that goes on between point A and point B, from when a vote is cast in a primary to when we actually get elected officials who are out there voting on bills. And so what we wanted to do with this project is, let's start with point A, which is the voters. And what are their incentives to vote in different types of primaries for different types of candidates? And then start taking that through the process. And there's some really important insights once you once you take this assumption all the way about what should happen with closed and open primaries. When you take that assumption all the way back to first principles and look at, well, what would the voters be doing? What are the strategic decisions that voters may take when they're deciding to vote in a primary? And the main theoretical insight that Matt came up with, which is really great, is that partisans in states who are dominated by the other party, they're the ones who have the greatest incentive to register as an independent so that they can vote in the other party's primary. But if their party's dominant within the state, they're going to keep their party registration. And so what we would expect then, if this is true, that in semi-closed states, and the reason why we're looking at semi-closed is those states also have party registration to make sure that only registered persons with a party can vote in that party's primary. If it's true, then what we should see is a greater number of independents in states that are lopsided towards either the Democrats or the Republicans. And that's exactly what we find. So comparing closed primary states, which is the lower, the ones in blue at the bottom here, those are all closed primary states. That's the number of independents, or the percentage of independents that you find in closed primary states. This is aggregate data, so this is the actual statistics that we get from election officials. The semi-closed states are those in the green and above, and if you look right about 50%, that's where you find the lowest number of independents, or lowest share. And as you get into an uncompetitive state in either direction, what you find is a greater number of people registering as independents. Now, we've actually looked even further at voter registration data within Rhode Island, one of these unbalanced states. We can actually see, this is a semi-closed state, Rhode Island, where there are literally over 100,000 people that we can identify who were registered as an independent on primary day, register with a political party, and then they changed their partisan registration back to independent to preserve their right to vote in another party's primary in a future election. So this is something that, just in one state, Rhode Island, that we see this sort of behavior going on. It must be then, if we look at other states and looking at this aggregate data, it must be that this is going on in other primary states. And it's literally something that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of voters are doing across this country in every primary election, and we don't even know that it's really up to this point that it's even happening. So it's really a great insight that there's something going on here. Voters are actually behaving in this way. And if we look, and this, by the way, might explain Alan's insight that if you look at party registration, it doesn't predict people's partisanship. Well, maybe this is what's going on here, is that there's this confound that you haven't quite controlled for yet. So maybe if you look a little bit more at the semi-closed versus closed and who's registering with the party and look at this dynamic, I think you might be able to uncover something more insightful, because Matt actually finds in his dissertation that party registration does anchor a person's partisanship, and it affects not their vote for president, but it does affect split ticket voting for House and Senate. So that's where I think, again, some maybe a little bit more investigation might be fruitful for your own research. So, and just to put a fine point on it, when we look at the CCS had a vote validation, also a party registration validation in 2010. And so if we look at it as predicted, what we see in semi-closed states is Republicans in a Democratic state are more likely to register as an independent, and Democrats in a semi-open state are more likely to register as an independent if it's a heavily Republican state. So when we even look at the individual level data, we validate what we see in the aggregate data. So there seems to be something here. Now the next step with this, which is what we're working on right now, is trying to identify in these semi-closed versus closed states and even open states, what effect does it have on the ideology of the incumbent that's elected. I haven't presented slides on that because we're still working out the models on it. But the preliminary work is that we are finding that in a semi-closed versus a closed state, or an open state versus semi-closed state, using Bonica's CF scores, we are finding that the more moderate candidate will be elected out of a semi-closed or open state versus a closed state. But again, that's tentative, so no slide for that yet. So that's the primaries. Next I want to talk about redistricting. This is a project that I've been working on for the past several years with Micah Altman. This is a project where the two of us created award-winning open source web accessible redistricting software, www.districtbuilder.org, and we deployed this software in support of advocacy efforts in several states. We actually had some official governments use the software as well. And as a consequence of this, we facilitated orders of magnitude more public participation in redistricting than we've seen in any previous redistricting cycle in the US. And it had some effects. I could give a whole talk about the effects of what we did here and actual successes and some failures, a lot of failure, but also some successes, real successes in terms of districts that were actually adopted using our software. So this isn't just theoretical. We moved beyond proof of concept to actual deployment and in support of actual redistricting in places like Minneapolis. But we had thousands of users create hundreds of plans, and we evaluate these plans on compactness and competitiveness and partisan fairness and locality splits, the things that we might be interested in as political scientists. And I would also say one other thing about this, because it's one of the reasons why we looked at the very first place at doing this open source software and getting crowdsourcing involved in redistricting is that Micah and I also have done a lot of work in producing automated redistricting algorithms. In fact, if you look at some of the research by, say, Rodden and Chen, early versions of their research were using algorithms that Micah and I developed. And what we learned very quickly is that those algorithms have certain biases in them, and we abandoned that approach of using automated redistricting to look at these problems because we know that the automated algorithms can get stuck in local optima and other things. Integer optimization is a very, very difficult problem. So we thought, well, if we can get people involved in this, maybe they're going to be able to see beyond what the computer can do. And we saw a lot of evidence of that as well in what the sort of things that we do. Now I'm going to address the very narrow question about polarization. Can we draw more competitive districts than what we currently have? And so here we have the adopted plan. It's a red triangle evaluated on compactness. and the number of competitive districts. This is using a 45 to 55% vote in the 2008 presidential election, normalized back to 50%. And so here it looks like, yeah, there's possibly some modest effects. This is, again, not to pick on Alan too much, but when he says that redistricting has no effect, actually, I'd say most of what we do in political science is looking at redistricting the wrong way, because we're not asking the right counterfactual question. We are asking the question of what was this plan adopted versus a plan that was previously adopted, both produced by a political process. And so what we're trying to do here is look at much larger set of feasible plans so that we can better inform about what the potential is for alternative trade-offs between different criteria. And so here again, it looks like you might be able to modestly get some more competition. Part of the reason is, like in a state like Ohio, in order to pull off the partisan gerrymander that you had in Ohio, you had to create some competitive districts for the Republicans. They had to protect a lot of incumbents, and they had to spread a lot of their Republican supporters around enough just so that they were drawing their districts right within that cusp of what would be a competitive district. And you get something similar in Virginia and in Florida. And by the way, this is competitiveness. If we look at partisan balance, there's no doubt that we could get much more partisan balance out of our redistricting plans. Again, here's compactness is going from least to most on the bottom. The plans that were adopted by Republicans were not compact at all. And you can produce plans that are fair. You can even produce plans that have a Democratic bias in them, above zero here in some of these states like Ohio and Florida, if you are permitted to do so. And there were members of the public that were drawing districts that had a partisan balance between Democrats and Republicans that are much, much more compact than what the plans that were adopted. So this doesn't really address the polarization, but it is kind of important because a number of people have said that, or believe that primarily through Rodden and Chen's work, that it's impossible to draw compact districts that have a partisan balance to them. And people in the public have pretty much demonstrated, no, you can get districts that are compact and, by the way, respect more political boundaries, are respecting the Voting Rights Act, in some cases actually increasing minority representation, and more compact, more partisan balance, and more competitive districts simultaneously. Because we're not anywhere near the frontier, the Pareto frontier, on any of the trade-offs between any of those criteria. Finally, small donors, and this is some work that I've been doing with a former master's student, Tyler Culberson. He's now at the FEC, and Suzanne Robbins, and we've been, my wife and colleague at George Mason, and now at University of Florida. So we've been looking at this data that Tyler was able to get to us, which is really great. This is the actual cleaned data from the FEC that they use and they process. And what's sort of important about this data, when we have this individual level data, is that we can look at not only the data that is the unitemized contributions, which is everyone under $200 that anyone who gives less than an aggregate of $200, not everyone, most people, most campaigns report aggregate contributions less than $200 as just an anonymous donation, except for some campaigns. And that's actually within the law, that the campaigns have the choice of whether or not they're going to itemize or unitemize these small donors. And so by getting the data that from the FEC, we're actually able to include the itemized small donors into our analysis, which no one else has. So this is data that no one else has been able to analyze because they haven't had the itemized small donors, which is the data that we've been looking at. And so what we do is we want to predict the aggregate amount of itemized small donations that that people are members of Congress are raising from their constituents and from the country as a whole. And we have a number of controls in there. We're looking at the ideology of the member, the ideology of the opponent, using, again, Bonica's CF scores. We're looking at competitiveness, lots of other controls. And so, again, for the purposes of this conference, we're most interested in polarization. And what if we're going to institute more small donations, if we're going to encourage these a greater number of small donations to somehow counter the influence of big money that's a popular reform right now, we want to know, well, what's the effect? What's the potential effect? Is it going to increase or decrease polarization if that's something that we care about as well? And so what we find when we look at this data and we break it down in incumbents, challengers, and candidates and open seats, is that on average, we only see an effect for incumbents. Extremism only seems to be related to an incumbent's ability to raise small donors. And so the most extreme incumbents raise $103,000 more in small donations from moderate incumbents. Now, it's not a large amount. I mean, most candidates aren't raising all that much money from small donors to begin with. There are only a few real big outliers that are like Michelle Bachmann or somebody like that who raises more than $8 million. But most people are not raising that much money. And so this is a substantial amount of the small donors that they are raising. And we don't really know what would happen if we changed the laws and had matching or some other reform that might encourage small donations. But we can at least see right now that it's only extremism is the only, at least in terms of polarization, is what's paying a dividend for small donations. And by the way, challengers to incumbents, not only does their extremism not seem to matter, it doesn't seem to matter if we look at the ability for challengers to raise money off of extreme candidates. And since Keith Poole is here, I would say we also looked at nominate scores, and we get the same effect, although we can't look at the challengers' ideology when we look at nominate scores. But if they're not statistically significant, well, maybe that's no omitted variable bias when we do that. So when we look back to it, I'd say primaries, yeah, I think there's a possibility there that they may diminish polarization. I think the current studies are potentially have missed this sort of dynamic that Matt and I have thought through, which is that it's really the unbalanced states, the highly Democratic Republican states that you may see moderation, and maybe it's not really. I mean, it would be aggregate polarization by encouraging more moderation, but you can still see polarization at the state level because you've got all of these Democrats and Republicans who are exiting their party's primary and voting in the other party's primary, and so it's making their primary a little bit more extreme or more either liberal or conservative as well. So. It has some effects. It has some potential there. Redistricting, I think it might have a modest effect as well. And small donors, well, if you really want to take empower small donors and try and take the power of big money out of politics, increases the small donors. At least what we can see right now within the patterns of giving to incumbents and challengers under the current framework, this may actually increase polarization. So thanks.
Thank you, Michael.